Hello, everybody. This is Miss Peachy from your WCA Biology B class. Today we are looking at a brand new unit, Unit 6 on biological evolution. Probably about 3/4 of the way through the semester at this point, although for me, second semester hasn't even begun. So here we are on Lesson 2, Evolution versus Natural Selection. So our key terms here are adaptation, evolution, mechanism, natural selection, population, reproductive success, mutations, gene flow, genetic drift, selection, and selective mating. And remember, as always, there's a link right below my picture on my website, which will link you to kind of like a notes guide or an outline or whatever for you to follow for this lesson. So this is kind of where we're kind of building up to this all semester, learning a lot. Actually, I would say we're building up to this all year at this point. So we learned a lot first semester about, how variation, inherited variation in populations kind of get started. We looked at, through meiosis, through a crossing over and independent assortment, as well as through fertilization and then mutations and things like that. We also talked a little bit about genetic drift and gene flow, and we're kind of putting that all together. So I love this unit. This is like my favorite unit this school year so far. All right, so you maybe have heard of the terms evolution and natural selection. That's kind of where this begins. A lot of people use these two interchangeably as though they mean the same thing. And they don't. They're talking about kind of the same idea, but evolution is change over time. It's organisms and looking at the fact that they do change over time. We can see evidence of evolution. We'll talk more about this in my live lessons. We can see lots of different evidence and that stuff that Charles Darwin kind of brought to the table. For one, we see fossil records that show change over time, and that's kind of like literally showing like a snapshot of evolution. We also see like in various areas around the world, we see like different organisms that all kind of have evolved independently of each other, but also they have like parallel evolution where they occur in the same climate. So we see that climate and those environmental factors are really kind of key in which organisms are successful and unsuccessful in certain ecosystems. So we can see this kind of evidence. Evolution happens. That's true. Now, what natural selection is, it is a mechanism. It tells us how evolution happens. So throughout history, we've seen multiple different hypotheses for different mechanisms. Like, how does this happen? Infamously, we have like Charles Darwin's natural selection, evolution by natural selection, Darwinian evolution, whatever you want to call it, has been compared to Lamarckian evolution and how they're very different from each other. And again, that's something we'll talk about in live lesson. So please make sure you come in because it's an interesting conversation. But mechanism means how does something happen? Like we know change over time happens, but like how? How does it happen? And that's where natural selection is one of the answers. It's not the only one, it's only one of them. There are multiple ways that can cause evolution in species over time. And natural selection is one of them. We see mutations which occur, which can be kind of a driving force behind natural selection for sure. We see gene flow, which is movement in and out of populations. It's essentially immigration and emigration. Organisms, they move around. They go from one place to another. And when they do that, you might get a population that has a specific trait in one geographic area that isn't found in a different geographic area. And so as they move, they take that trait with them and then they exchange genes when mating occurs in a new area, right? We've talked about genetic drift, which I think we'll talk more about in the future as well. But these are those accidental changes, those external random events that change the allele frequency in a population. Green beetles versus brown beetles. Who remembers this from first semester? I'm going to remind you with a picture. So some of you may remember this example that I did during one of my live lessons first semester. If not, you'll see this probably again in our live lesson this semester as well. But an example of genetic drift is what's happening here. Here we have a careless individual who is walking through a population of beetles. And as he walks through the population of beetles, it just so happens that he steps on more green beetles than brown beetles because the population has two phenotypes, green and brown. As you can see, there's fewer green than brown, but he steps on almost all of them. So in our next generation, what we find is lower number of green beetles than we had previous because there's fewer green beetles that can go on to repopulate in that area. Had he completed the job and actually stepped on all the green beetles by accident, you can actually eliminate an entire phenotype from a population through this type of accidental kind of random event. Um, a person walking through a population of green and brown beetles is one example. Other things could be things like a wildfire that destroys the majority of a forest except for one small area where there maybe only happens to be one type of tree, whereas the whole forest had multiple types of like hardwood deciduous trees, and now we're just stuck with one kind left. So it changed the allele frequency in that population, in that community of trees in that case, right? And these events work best in small areas because the events themselves are more likely to impact a larger percentage of the population when the population itself is small, right? So when we start with a small population and you destroy almost all of one kind, then you're going to see those effects much more apparent in future populations. If you have a very large population, it's probably a random event isn't likely to impact a large population in the same way. So it's much more impactful in small populations. So this changes the allele frequency of, in this case, beetles, right? Brown beetles versus green beetles. That's evolution. It's change over time. We are changing how common a specific trait is in a population over time. That is by means of genetic drift. But we're going to talk a little bit more about by means of natural selection. So, natural selection is kind of like it's the most, of all the different mechanisms that we see, it's the most permanent and also drives more kind of radical changes in population. We also see selection, such as natural selection and artificial selection, although, that is something that is not obviously natural because we call it artificial. So, and selective mating, which is again, um, you can kind of include that in the selection process as well. I feel like those kind of go together, really. A lot of times I don't really see those differentiated that often. So what the heck is natural selection? So the big thing about natural selection is that there is a trait that makes that organism better fit in a specific environment for survival. Survival includes living and reproduction. So living is wonderful. We all want to live. But if you don't reproduce and carry those genes to the next generation, you're not going to see a change in over time. That's not going to happen. So you have to have reproduction involved in natural selection. The traits that we're talking about make them more fit. We say survival of the fittest. You may have heard that phrase before. Fitness in this case does not mean how physically fit you are. It can be. That can be a trait. But fitness literally means how well adapted, how well suited you are for survival and reproduction in that environment. So there are things that kind of determine what is and isn't fit. Specifically, the environment is one big thing, right? Like what's the temperature, how the food sources, predators in the environment, amount of sunlight. I mean, there's so many different external factors that are going to determine which traits are more advantageous and which traits are less advantageous. Those environmental characteristics change over time. So one of the driving forces behind natural selection is as the environment changes, so too does the traits that actually mean you're fit and make you better equipped to survive, right? So we can see that as environment fluctuates, then we see bigger changes in populations. Also, there's competition within species. So we were talking about before how the environment affects you. There's predators you got to escape from, or if you are the predator, you got to be able to get yourself food and stuff like that. But there's also competition within your own species. So you compete for food. There's only so much food available. We've already talked about carrying capacity and limiting factors and how food is one of them. There's only so much food available. If there's not enough food, you better be good at getting the food or you're not going to be able to survive because you'll starve. There's competition for space, competition for mates, right? So all of these competitive factors are what we call selection pressures. So both the environment and competition, all kind of are pressures, and you need to have the best equipped traits to ensure that you can eat and mate and live. And if you don't, you die and your DNA just dies with you. You don't get to pass that on to offspring. That's natural selection. So natural selection is built upon the idea that there are traits that help you to survive. Those types of traits we call adaptations. Adaptations specifically refer to traits that help survival. There are lots of variation in populations, but not all traits really make a difference, right? If that trait is kind of neutral, it doesn't really help you, it doesn't really hurt you, then we don't see much change in the frequency of that trait from one generation to the next. It's pretty much stays the same, right? If it's neither harmful nor helpful, then the trait kind of remains consistently at the same level. If the trait is helpful, we'll see that that trait starts to become more predominant in the next generation. Hey, that's that word we talked about for your portfolio in the last unit. It may be a dominant allele, it may be a recessive allele, it doesn't matter. It is predominant because it is more common to have that trait because that trait helps to ensure survivability, right? If the trait is negative, if it actually helps you to get killed or eliminates the possibility of mating, then we'll see that trait decline in frequency and become less predominant as time goes on. And as time goes on, generation after generation, you'll see a marked change in the frequency of these traits. You'll see an increase in the alleles that indicate success, that are considered to be um, adaptations, and we'll see a decrease in alleles that are negative. And then those again that are neutral pretty much stay at the same frequency no matter what, because they don't either help you or hurt you, so they don't change. And so that's what natural selection actually is. So it gives you some examples here of natural selection through time. I'm just looking here, making sure I covered everything in this particular. Uh, yeah, that's pretty much it. I think the last thing is if you get to some more examples here. I don't need to go through all these examples. You guys can read through those. Reading is fundamental. And we get to kind of this last part where it talks a bit about artificial selection. So artificial selection is actually where human beings have kind of done what nature does already. It builds upon traits, it selects for traits, or we select for traits that we find to be advantageous. It doesn't help the survivability of the species generally, but it helps us because we like them better. So maybe we especially see this, we see this in plants and animals, but we see this a lot in agriculture, how different crops have been cultivated for specific traits, make them larger fruit size or longer maybe shorter growing season. If you have like, we live in the great north like we do, we want to make sure that our vegetables are ripe and ready for harvest earlier than maybe they would naturally be able to be ready for. So we select for vegetables that can come to, that you can sow later and then they germinate quicker and then they are, producing fruits much, much earlier than maybe they would in the wild. We select for those that have more abundant, like more fruit or more whatever, more yield to them. So this has been done for thousands of years. And we've really, really perfected this. So you can go to the grocery store and find giant tomatoes. I mean, naturally, they would never grow that big. Or you can find my biggest pet peeve, these gigantic grapes. They're huge. Yay. Big grapes. Love them. Hate them. They're disgusting. They don't taste like anything. But they're so big and juicy, and maybe people like that. But we've selected so much for size in grapes that, in my opinion, flavor has gone out the window. Um, they select for things that help these vegetables to stay fresher longer once they're harvested, vegetables and fruits, right? So that they can be picked and sent to grocery stores and they're not decomposing by the time they get there. So that's artificial selection. And it's essentially replicating nature, right? So we're taking traits and we're only breeding those that have the traits that we want. And so from one generation to the next, we're going to get more yield that have that desirable trait until after thousands of years, we're really only getting those that have the desirable trait. We're no longer getting those because the alleles for the less desirable traits have pretty much been eradicated at this point. And so nature does the same thing, or we could say we are pretty much um, like echoing nature in artificial selection. Interestingly, artificial selection is actually something that Darwin looked at and kind of helped him to think about and formulate the theory of natural selection as well. So it was kind of um, one of those things that he read about or knew about that helped to help him put the puzzle pieces together. So that is it from Unit 6, Lesson 2, Evolution versus Natural Selection. We have some more lessons to go. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you guys in my next recording. Bye, guys.